show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host, Scott Mitchell. Scott, how are you? You have a different background to normal. Where are you? Where in the world is Scott Mitchell?
Yeah, those joining on video, thanks for springing me, Oz. Now I'll be able to keep my location secret. I'm in a slightly dingy motel room in Sydney, where I came to visit a friend over the weekend. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm actually really good at the moment, Scott. I had a pretty transcendent film going experience to start my week, and I've kind of been running on a high ever since.
What was that?
I went to the IMAX to watch One Battle After Another, the latest film by Paul Thomas Anderson, and it may not be a surprise, Scott, to either you, to people who listen to this podcast, to people who have followed my work over the years, that I am a big PTA head. You know, I feel like I would count There Will Be Blood, The Master, Phantom Thread, Boogie Nights, Magnolia in my top 20 films ever. So the idea of this movie, Paul Thomas Anderson adapting a Pynchon novel kind of loosely about 60s era radicals adapting into Reagan era America and what they kind of lost and whether it was all worth it, but bringing that into the contemporary time period and looking at America today, but also doing all the things that Paul Thomas Anderson does, which is the idea of family and found family and this father-daughter story that is really at the heart of this movie. I kind of could talk about it for another 2 hours, but I don't think that is what the purpose of this podcast is. You can read my whole review in Letterboxd, but I got to say this is one of my favorite films of the year, and I had a really, really good time watching it. If you got an opportunity to watch this movie at the IMAX, I strongly, strongly recommend it.
Yeah, I'm gonna take your recommendation on that. Although, I don't see what I could possibly get out of a film about, people who believe in revolutionary politics crashing up against the 80s, trying to decide whether to kind of protect family and pursue that, or whether to stay the cause or prepare for the next battle. I don't know how I could possibly relate to that, Oz.
If you don't know what Scott's talking about, you should read his dad's memoir, which goes into basically all of the above. I feel like, Scott, out of everyone I know in my life, this movie, particularly because of the family element set amid the backdrop of failed revolution, this is extremely your jam.
Failure, let's not throw around failure. Speaking of Hollywood, Oz, I've been liking kicking off episodes lately with kind of the tabloid stories we're currently obsessed with. And I have to say, I've been swept up in a tabloid and Hollywood story. The devastating news that our Nick and our Keith are calling it quits. Oz, there have been so many angles to read about in the last few days about this that I am obsessed with all of them. There's Keith moving out. There's Nick losing her mum. Was that a factor? There's so many breakout stories. Every outlet is running 4 different stories on each aspect of this. It's incredible reading. But I, of course, went to, maybe my favorite writer in Australian journalism, the legendary Andrew Hornery, who posted...
Oh, and Hornery was back on the gossip column for
I
this.
got this direct from his Instagram where he shared that he remembered covering their wedding. He said, quote, "People lined the streets to cheer her as she drove to the ceremony. She was moved to tears. I also remember talking to Keith years later and being quite taken with how enamored he remained with his wife. Yet here we are. You just never know." And I think that sums up all of the feelings for those of us like me who are devastated about this. You just never know sometimes, Oz.
I'm sort of surprised by how swept up in this you are. I mean, I'm not surprised that the media has gone ballistic on this. It's a tabloid breakup, and I am by no means above caring about celebrity relationships or breakups. I just kind of don't care about Nicole and Keith at all. And I'm genuinely surprised and kind of flummoxed by how many people are like, no, if they can't make it work, no one can. I just did not realize that people projected so much onto this particular couple?
I think
Like,
it's just
what
a
is it?
great
What is it?
example of sort of two, an unlikely pairing, slightly odd cats, I would say, who sort of found each other and seemed fulfilled. And also, I unironically adore Nicole Kidman. I think she'd be a great hang. Little media recommendation from me, the film To Die For, directed by Gus Van Sant, where she plays a local weather presenter who gets involved in a murder plot. Incredible searing insight into the media that I would recommend highly.
Yeah, I think maybe the other reason why I've maybe like care less about this is Nicole Kidman's filmography of late, like just some real mid-tier, like Netflix type of movies and TV shows that didn't really work. I feel like she deserves a better place in like public and Hollywood consciousness than I think where she is currently at right now.
Probably true, but I think people sleeping on some of the incredible earlier work. There's some amazing performances in there. She's genuinely incredible.
Well, look, I'm happy if this leads to like a rediscovery of her filmography. I would much rather read a story that's like, I know I was going to say I'd much rather read a story that's like 10 Nicole Kidman films you should watch, but that's normally what they do when someone dies, not when they just like go through a separation in their relationship.
Maybe I'll do that in the newsletter this week. Oz, anything catch your eye?
Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to touch on briefly before we get into the episode proper, and it's to do with a topic that we've covered a few times on the show, our favorite Irish hip-hop group Kneecap, and how the Australian media and like just general elite establishments continually try to find ways to create controversies around this band. We should say, last time we talked about them, one of their members, Mo Cara Liam, was facing terrorism charges. Those charges have now been dismissed by the British courts, so that is all good news for Kneecap. Quite an extraordinary story. But they've been back in the Australian media this week because Mad Monday, Scott. I know that you're not an AFL person. How familiar are you with the concept of Mad Monday?
Pretty familiar. I once interviewed the little person that St Kilda set on fire at a Mad Monday.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. So this is like historically Mad Mondays have been pretty like wild affairs where footy players, once the season is done, kind of dress up and just do all sorts of ridiculous things. Lately, I feel like they've been less ridiculous because of the advent of like smartphones and the scrutiny they're under, but they still dress up and seem to try to have a good time, you could say. This year, 3 members of Geelong, who have a pretty solid Irish contingent in their team, dressed as members of Kneecap. And like, it's a dress-up thing, like, fair enough. There was some, I would say, slightly more dubious costuming going on, including one player who dressed as Caroline Wilson, which, a lot of players don't like Caroline Wilson because of the scandals that she reports on and she covers the AFL. I feel like that is maybe more dubious than dressing as Kneecap, but for some reason that was like the example of the controversial costuming choice the Age newspaper chose to lead their Mad Monday coverage with. And there was one line in particular that really grated me. It was this reference to the fact that when Alex Pearce, the Fremantle captain who we discussed a few months ago, when he posted in support of Kneecap, this story emerged in the West Australian news that Jewish organizations were like unhappy and distressed by that. And we actually like went deep on that story and found that just like wasn't true. Not that we would automatically defer to some of these like quite ridiculous pro-Israel Zionist lobby groups, but even in this instance, they didn't even get exercised. This was like one AFL reporter who kept hounding the AFL and Fremantle asking questions, and there just was no controversy. So months later, seeing the Age hinge an entire story on the supposed anger that Jewish groups had to football players for supporting Kneecap felt like ridiculous. Like, I just don't understand how big newspapers can just repeat these things. So if you just read that story without any context, you would think Kneecap are a terrible group who Jewish organizations in Australia hate, and it is very, very bad that football players are wearing Irish flag balaclavas. It just kind of was really stupid, honestly, Scott. I don't have much more to say than that.
Totally. It sounds it.
All right, let's get into today's show. We mentioned on Monday's episode that Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to Washington was likely to lead to something extremely bad and also consequential, and that's pretty much what we got, Scott. Trump and the Israeli PM unveiled their 20-point plan for ending the war in Gaza, which includes the cessation of hostilities, but would also appoint a council led by Trump himself to have complete and total authority over the lives of Palestinians in Gaza. The only thing more depressing than that, I think, is how the plan was so quickly endorsed by a range of world leaders including our own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. It remains to be seen if Hamas will accept the plan, which basically would eradicate them, but with Trump threatening to continue supporting Netanyahu's genocide if they don't sign up, they may not have much of a choice. So we'll discuss the plan, how we got here, and how it's being received by the world and the media here in Australia. And also in today's show, how do media organizations struggling with declining subscriber numbers and readers, a loss of audience trust, combat that structural collapse? Well, of course, they turn to advertising agencies. Why wouldn't you? The 9 newspapers, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, have unveiled a shiny new marketing campaign this week, pitching themselves as the balanced, non-clickbaity home of reason, complete with a moody black and white video. We're going to share our thoughts on that campaign and share our tips on what newspapers could actually do if they wanted to really rebuild their reputations. Plus, Scott, if you are one of the people that didn't think Australia's media was concentrated enough, well, good news, it's about to get even more so, with news that Seven is about to merge with SCA, the home of Triple M, the Listener Podcast Network, and much more. It's a deal that will have huge ramifications for the country's media landscape, and we will explain why.
Oh no. After that, in Keeping Tabs, I'm going to talk about mainstream media outlets acknowledging independent media, whether they're refusing to, and a little furor that kicked up this week with The Guardian Australia and our neck of the woods Oz independent media. And as a reminder, everyone can support Lamestream and what we do by subscribing at lamestream.com.au to get our newsletter full of exclusive stories, analysis, and recommendations of the best in media and culture.
Please do. It is the best way to support our work and keep us doing what we do. All right, Scott, talk to me about Trump's plan to rule Gaza.
Yeah, Oz. People will know Donald Trump appeared with Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House on Tuesday, Australia time, and announced a 20-point plan for peace. We mentioned this meeting was worth keeping an eye on during our episode on Monday, and it certainly was. Trump announced his plan alongside Netanyahu with no Palestinian representative, which I think is the first sign of how we should read this, Oz, but regional Arab governments have given it support along with Western allies like Anthony Albanese. He even bragged he knew about the plan, discussed it with world leaders last week. And I just thought we should play a little bit of that.
Australia welcomes President Trump's plan to bring peace to Gaza after 2 years of conflict and a devastating loss of life. Australia has long called for a ceasefire. We have called for the hostages to be released and for Hamas to give up its arms. I certainly have welcomed the opportunity to discuss the plans for a ceasefire moving forward over the past week with a range of leaders.
Now, Oz, this deal would see the release of all Israeli hostages within 72 hours of the deal being accepted by Hamas, then the return of thousands of Palestinians who are being held by Israel, and an end to the fighting, with Hamas laying down their weapons or being given safe passage into exile from Gaza before an outside administration led by Donald Trump and former UK PM and a man who should have had to defend war crimes charges in a court of law, Tony Blair, taking over running Gaza as part of this independent administration, with the Israeli military replaced by an international stabilization force, with the idea that they'd hand back control to the Palestinian Authority at some vague point in the future. Oz, that is a lot for people to get their heads around. Obviously, anything that I think stops the slaughter for any length of time, no matter how fanciful, has to be some relief. But, is this plan legit? Who benefits from it? It's confusing when the Western press is at odds with each other over how to read this, and you actually sent me this, but if Australians got their news from the 9 newspapers, the SMH and The Age, they found an analysis piece saying Trump had finally outfoxed Netanyahu by Matthew Knott, who credited Trump for forcing Netanyahu to commit to some kind of post-war plan, saying, quote, "The Trump plan deserves credit for taking some of the most destructive ideas for post-war Gaza off the table." While, Australians who get their news from the ABC found John Lyons writing, Netanyahu had outmaneuvered Trump. So which is it? He said it looked like a recipe for ongoing occupation, writing, "The plan insists the Palestinian Authority must reform. The judge of that reform will, it appears from this plan, be Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. This is not the proposal of an honest, independent broker." I think I'm going to take lines over not on that, Oz, but before we get into unpacking what the plan is, what did you make of, the reaction to this from media and politicians around the world?
There's been several times, Scott, over the past couple of years where I've had to kind of take pause and look around and wonder, am I losing my mind, or is literally every single other person in the world losing their minds? And this is one of those moments, right? This plan that is being discussed as a kind of sober, smart, brave, well-intentioned, supported by so much of the world. This plan that is being described in these ways is something that we have never seen since the end of World War II. This is a neo-colonialist concept. This idea that Donald Trump and Tony Blair would be the de facto dictators of Gaza, a province in the Middle East that the British were forced to withdraw from 100 years ago, it's extraordinary. And I guess why I'm saying I'm losing my mind is because the way that I just described it and how extraordinary and unprecedented and insane it is. And it's not just any US president, which I don't think would make it better, but Donald Trump, with everything that we know and everything that we've been reporting on and everything that people who say they care about, the rise of fascism and say they hate Donald Trump, the way that it is being written, the way that it is being discussed as though it is a normal, sensible plan that we should all probably get behind just because it stops the slaughter. I genuinely don't know if I'm going crazy or if everyone else is going crazy. Maybe it is good. Maybe it is good because it stops the slaughter. But I just can't really accept that we have gotten to a point where anything that stops Israel's bombardment is something that we should accept or welcome. I think this is exactly the point that Israel and the US wanted us to get to. The whole point of such a devastating, long-term bombardment, genocide, slaughter, eradication of an entire people is designed because there's only two possible outcomes, right? One is they conclude their genocide and kill everyone, or they do something that is just one step less heinous than that, and we're all supposed to welcome it because it isn't the complete eradication of the Palestinians in Gaza. I think that's where we've ended up. I think our expectations are so broken because of what we've seen on the last 2 years. We're being forced to discuss this as though it's a sensible plan, when it is the second worst thing to ever happen to Gaza following the genocide that we've been witnessing over the last 2 years. And in particular, I think the Australian media coverage of this is sort of worse to me than anything happening internationally. Because as we've discussed many times on the show before, so much of how Australians cover this stuff is based on what the Prime Minister does. And so when the Prime Minister came out and said, this is a good plan, I support it, Australian political journalists just kind of fell into line, with that really interesting exception of John Lyons at the ABC that you pointed out. Like Matthew Knott saying, given the dire situation in Gaza, though this is an imperfect plan for peace, it's better than no plan at all. I just struggle to understand how we are talking so, I guess, soberly about something as extreme and fundamentally wrong as this plan. The Guardian story on this, the domestic Australian Guardian political story on this was headlined, "There is hope," right? Quoting Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister. There is no fucking hope. There is no fucking hope. And I kind of refuse to be pushed by the news organizations and the politicians that did nothing to stop this, and in fact did so many things to exacerbate it and make it as bad as possible. I refuse to be pushed by them into accepting that we have to just kind of cop this plan because it ends the slaughter. I don't want to fall into that trap. I think they are as culpable in this as anyone else. I think the Australian media, who failed to hold the Australian government, the US government to account, who made excuses for Albanese's dithering on this, who spent most of their time attacking people opposing the genocide, now kind of forcing down our throats, well, we've just got to accept the plan. You might not like it, but we've got to do it. I don't think that we should be in that position, Scott. I feel very, very, very upset and angry and quite shaken by where this has gone. And I think it's really interesting that John Lyons is like a lone voice against this stuff. I think he deserves respect for pointing out how fundamentally broken this whole concept is.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I think this is an incredibly disturbing plan. But I wanted to sort of canvass where we were in terms of the conversation. I've mentioned before, I know that I think that when you want to know what is really going on with these kind of announcements, look to what Netanyahu and his government are telling their audience in Israel. I think that is super telling. And it's very different to what they say to the Western media. And I should add that just hours after this appearance next to Trump, Netanyahu posted a video to his Telegram channel saying, "Instead of Hamas leading to our isolation, we turned the tables and isolated Hamas. Now the entire world, including the Arab and Muslim world, is pressuring Hamas to accept the conditions we set together with President Trump, bragging that while this happens, the IDF remains in most of the territory." And I think that's what this is all about, Oz, isolating Hamas. Like, first, to break down this plan for people and where it actually came from, because I think that's very telling. People will know that Trump's last proposal for post-war Gaza was to turn it into what he called a Riviera of the Middle East. He said in February, during Netanyahu's last visit to the White House, "Everybody I've spoken to loves the idea of the United States owning that piece of land, developing and creating thousands of jobs with something that will be magnificent," referring to Gaza, talking about US owning Gaza. Now, most Western media analysis and some of the stuff you quoted has basically said like, "Oh, amazing. Trump's ditched that. How fantastic. Like, he's consulted with Arab leaders on this new plan, and that is why he's not doing this crazy plan anymore." I don't think it's that simple, Oz. We know that Donald Trump desperately wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and Gaza Riviera wasn't going to get him it, because no Arab state would ever accept Gaza Trump Riviera. So in comes Tony Blair. We've learned in recent weeks that Blair, the British Prime Minister who was a principal architect of the invasion of Iraq, has been working on a proposal that would see him chair a board that would run Gaza. On the morning before Trump's announcement, Oz, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz obtained a leaked version of the document that had been circulated to Trump and other world leaders less than 2 weeks ago from Blair. And it's incredibly grim, Oz, and actually has a lot more similarities, I would argue, to Trump's Gaza Riviera than would first appear. It's basically Gaza being run like a corporation, with a CEO and a board with Blair as chair. Blair stresses in it that any Muslims placed on the board to give it credibility with Gazans should have, quote, long-standing business credibility. This is, to me, is a corporatization of Gaza.
Yep.
Obviously, all of these people would probably have some kind of immunity from legal responsibility for anything that happens. And it appears to me, Oz, that Trump simply took this plan and said, "Oh, if we're going to do this, I'm going to be chair. Donald J. Trump will be chair. Blair's taking a more deputy role. And this body will run Gaza for the foreseeable future, a foreign corporate entity that will probably be able to act with legal impunity."
I can't understand how these world leaders who are endorsing this plan, Macron, Starmer, Albanese, can look at a plan on paper that is exactly what you said it is a corporate board structure led by Donald Trump and Tony Blair will run a region in Palestine with a 2 million person population and have ultimate power over that. How can they do that? And how can people in this country, including journalists, but also just like regular people, just kind of cop that this is the way the world operates? Like, how are people not understanding how far fucking gone things are? And if they don't understand how these people are operating to carve up the world between themselves, and it's actually not that different to Gaza Riviera. I think that's kind of your point. It's like there is clearly a real estate imperative, like Trump talked about in his press conference, the need to redevelop Gaza. And when he says redevelop, I kind of don't think he means civilian infrastructure. I think he literally means like develop as a real estate developer. Remember, Trump is a real estate developer. Jared Kushner, who's a key part of all the behind-the-scenes negotiations, his son-in-law is a real estate developer. Stephen Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy to the Middle East, who's been negotiating this, is a real estate developer. This is the most powerful and demented people in the world carving up Gaza amongst themselves to develop. And our government, our Labor government that people want to make excuse after, people want to vote for, people want to say you're crazy if you criticize them because what about Peter Dutton? What about the coalition? They are supporting it. And our media are not even accurately describing what is going on, let alone being a voice for criticism. It's crazy. And Blair's involvement, as you said, Blair should be tried at The Hague and imprisoned for life, if anything. There was a really interesting reporting, Scott, in the past week from the New Statesman, very credible British news publication, that looked at the fact that since 2021, the Tony Blair Institute, which is the think tank he runs, has been funded to the tune of £257 million by none other than Larry Ellison. This motherfucker keeps popping up on our show because he's got his fingers in every pie. One of Trump's close friends, the biggest private donor to the Israeli Defense Force, very pro-Israel figure, has been funding Blair for the past 5 years. And now Blair is the 2IC on this fucking board. It is crazy.
And to anybody who is just absent critical faculties to see why a sort of imposed corporate insane structure, why that is wrong, it bears striking similarity to, we mentioned Iraq and Tony Blair. Like the last time a foreign administration was imposed was the Paul Bremer Authority over Iraq, which was the temporary government. It was given full legal impunity. That's how Abu Ghraib happened. That's how some of the most shocking torture and heinous atrocities committed by Western forces ever in the Middle East happened, was because you imposed an administration with legal impunity in the middle of the Middle East. How do we think that thing's going to run over the years that it may? But Oz, I think my bigger fear, I mean, that is all horrific, but my biggest fear is I don't think we're even going to see any of this happen. As Netanyahu said, he sees this as about isolating Hamas. What does he mean by that? Well, if we look at like every ceasefire agreement Israel has signed up to, there's a pattern. So let's look at like Lebanon. A ceasefire agreement was signed there in November of last year. Since then, Israel have killed more than 150 people in Lebanon. Just on Monday this week, Oz, a strike killed a guy operating an excavator in Lebanon, driving an excavator, enough for Israel to strike you. So what has the US reaction been to these violations? What should we expect? Well, Trump's negotiator for Lebanon, this guy Tom Barak, said in this wild interview the other week about, you know, what the US's reaction to this is, what the US reconstruction plan in Lebanon is. He said about the Lebanese army, you're arming them so they can fight their own people, Hezbollah. So they look at constant Israeli ceasefire violations and go, great, let's sow some factional sectarian warfare in Lebanon and arm the Lebanese army to kill Hezbollah. Fantastic. And to me, this is where this Gaza plan is going. Every Arab regional government is afraid of disagreeing with Trump, so they've signed up, and it sets the stage for Israel to trap Hamas. Even if Hamas agrees to this deal in the coming days, Israel will be able to violate the agreement with impunity as they have in Lebanon. And if one militant from Hamas or Islamic Jihad or any of the other groups in Gaza attacks the Israeli military, I'm very afraid that Trump will greenlight Netanyahu to rain down hell on Gaza, something that Netanyahu foreshadowed he would at the press conference if Hamas didn't abide by the deal. And what's going to happen is you're going to have the most powerful militaries in the world basically greenlighting the punishment of Gazans for the failure of a bonkers plan.
Yeah, I fear you are probably right. I mean, I think like the plan, anyone involved in signing the plan, any militant faction in Gaza that signs the plan is effectively saying we are eradicating ourselves, right, from existing. The chances of there being some factions, whether that's Islamic Jihad or the PFLP or even just like individual militants, right, from those factions saying, actually, like, fuck you. And this always happens, right, with negotiations. Throughout like modern history, when there are negotiations done and formal parties sign up to them, you get breakaway groups that say we're the the anti-treaty faction. And it doesn't matter who those individuals are, whether they're Hamas or not. The second that one rocket fires across the border, the second that one soldier from Israel is shot at, Netanyahu will say, well, we're still going to like take over all of this stuff, but we are now also going to rain down hellfire and bombs on you as well. I think that is inevitable. And like, why wouldn't they? As you described, look at what they've been doing with impunity in Lebanon. They keep bombing Syria. Like, they just keep killing Arabs every fucking day and no one says anything. And then Western leaders just support this plan when it's rolled out. And one of the things, Scott, that you mentioned is like the way these Arab states have kind of just signed up to Trump. And this is something Albanese specifically said. He was in the UAE when this was announced, and he said, there is support across the Muslim world for this deal, so we should take it seriously. The list of Muslim countries that have signed up to support this Gaza plan is run through them. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the UAE themselves, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, Qatar, Egypt. These are all like dictatorships, right? Some religious dictatorships, some military dictatorships who detest Hamas and generally have very close ties with the US. That's with the exception of Indonesia and Pakistan. In the case of Pakistan, the current PM is there as the result of like a de facto US coup against Imran Khan. So it's just like using these governments of these countries to pretend that there is some kind of like genuine Arab or Muslim support for this deal is patently ridiculous. Trump knows that. Netanyahu knows that. Albanese knows that, and he's not getting pushed on it at all. Like, fuck Albanese being there in the UAE saying, I've just visited this mosque. It's such a beautiful country. The Muslim world is supporting this deal, so we should as well. He is lying through his teeth and making up excuses to support this heinous deal. I'm repeating myself, but like, I can't believe he's getting away with it, man. And the complicity of all of these people has been driving me crazy. And I think the other thing, we talked about this earlier in the week, you and I, we messaged a bit about this. It's kind of gotten buried in all of this news, even though I think it is really relevant. The New York Times did some updated polling on American attitudes to Israel and Israel's bombardment in Gaza. And I think this is a factor. Like, why is Trump putting the pressure on Netanyahu to kind of wrap this up now? The US public has had enough of this. Like, the polling is really interesting. It shows that even older white Americans who have historically supported Israel no matter what and supported America funding Israel hundreds of billions of dollars in aid over the recent years, they are turning against Israel. They no longer want their money going to bomb Palestinians. They don't support Israel's genocide. And Trump has like a domestic political concern there. And it's sort of kind of grimly ironic that at a moment at which the public has finally shifted, even in America on this topic, the worst possible deal is being presented and signed off on. And I don't really know what else to do about that other than yell at you on our podcast about it. But it's really tough to see this stuff, to see how our politicians in Australia are responding, how our media is responding, and just kind of like go on with your day. I think I'm finding that quite tough.
It is tough. Can we at least call it yelling with me rather than yelling at me?
True. You've done a good job of keeping your temper under control. But I'm yelling, with you, supported by you, heard well by you, and we are frustrated by this. Yeah. Scott, after the break, we'll take a look at how the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald newspapers are trying to convince the Australian public to sign up and read them. Scott, last year when I was still working at the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, the company rolled out this big, shiny advertising campaign. And as companies tend to do in these moments, they tried to get all of us very excited about it. They emailed it around. There was like all staff meetings. They tried to get everyone to feel like we were all in this together. And let me tell you, it didn't really work. I think mainly because at the time, all the staff were gearing up for pay negotiations with management, and no one really wanted to like celebrate the fact that the company was spending God knows how many millions of dollars on some advertising agency and like buying up phone boxes and billboards and digital ads all over the place. I think the other reason why this campaign didn't really excite people was the campaign itself. Like, it was this 30-second ad bit. It had a knockoff Tame Impala song. It revolved around this one guy, this actor, this extremely boring looking white guy using the app in different scenarios. And it's like food, puzzles, news, sport. It's got it all. Just that's the whole point of a newspaper. It was very unclear why this was supposed to be such a great ad campaign. It did not light up the world of media and advertising. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about last year's ad campaign?
My main thought about it was that I thought it was interesting kind of pivot from, I think, the last campaign most people would remember, which really focused on star journalists. Like it was a campaign that went around that was like Kate McClymont, Nick McKenzie, I think Peter Fitzsimons was in there, but it was sort of like, and that had, I had my problems with that for other reasons of kind of, it seemed to be emphasizing these tent poles and sort of everyone else would just churn content and they would do real journalism. But it's still sort of tried to sell people on like, we have some of the best journalists in the country, like subscribe for that. Whereas that campaign seemed like a kind of pivot away from selling the journalism and selling like an app experience as like the brand
very much
offer. So that was my only thought on that not being at the company at the time.
Well, good news, Scott, because now we're a year on from that campaign and they've got another one, right?
Oh.
And interested to talk about this one. It's been done by the same agency, right? Already let's like just cool our jets a little bit on how excited we want to get. It's taken a pretty different approach though. Like it kind of has tried to reposition itself around the journalism again. I think this ad is a really interesting insight into where the papers themselves are positioning themselves, like what they think they're doing and who they think their target market is. And I think that's why it's a pretty interesting like thing to look at and to dissect. This campaign is called Here's to Reason, and it's shot in black and white. It features a wide, very diverse, and we'll come back to the diversity, cast, a range of supposed readers of the Age and the Herald newspaper, and a voiceover explains like why all of these people love reading the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Let's listen to a little bit of it.
These people worry about the environment. These people do too, but they just can't give up their car. These people invest in property. Well, for these people, it's out of reach. This is Sydney. Millions of different worldviews.
The campaign's also being rolled out in print as well, like in the newspapers, and it includes copy like, in a world of extremes, reason is the boldest choice. That's why the SMH and the Age choose reason, and why we give our readers balanced, reasonable news. You're kind of detecting a bit of a theme there, and the company has called this ad campaign a, quote, rallying cry for reason. The paper's executive editor, Luke McElveen, said the campaign reflects the paper's commitment to giving readers the full picture, not just a shrill headline or an inflammatory position for clicks. Scott, there is a fair bit I want to say about this campaign and the way the company is talking about it, but let me get your take first off.
My main takeaway is just like advertising is an incredible racket, isn't it? Like imagine getting paid for that. Like, it just seems to me like the product of an advertising agency cliche, I think, which is like have a very base level, fairly brain dead idea of like people with different views all read the paper and this is how you get to the reasonable center by reading the paper, and then kind of over creative and over emote and over intellectualize it to the point that you sort of have this like filled with pathos VO and tagline that really is laughably simplistic, and I feel like is really only going to appeal to a very small number of people feel that impassioned by that message rather than like exposing injustice or getting some kind of information you can't get elsewhere. That the idea that you'll be so inflamed by sensibleness that you will become a subscriber is fairly fanciful, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting insight into like what they think gets people excited and the appeal to reason. I mean, this idea, it's a pretty clear attempt to position the papers somewhere in the middle, in the center, this idea of balance that they've been explicit about and how the papers are an authority and you should listen to them and not listen to the extremes. I kind of think part of that is actually not bad. Like I think it's reasonable to imagine that there is a demographic of people in this country who probably would have read these papers 10, 20, 30 years ago, who do feel a bit exercised about how extreme in their minds things are on social media, and they wish that there was just something smart, authoritative, and use like real journalistic values. But I feel like even though they get close to talking about like how important it is to have real journalists and real editors and real teams to cover this stuff, they sort of like ditch all that and just come back to this idea of reason, right? And this idea of just being in the middle. I think the problem with that is if you just define yourself as being in the middle, you kind of don't end up standing for anything, and you end up in these weird, like, contradictory places. And in that ad that we played earlier, there's this really funny bit, my favorite bit, where they're talking about one group of readers who care about the environment, but then there's this other group of readers who don't want to give up their cars, right? And so it's sort of just like, what is the centrist position on climate change? It's like, I care about it, but I don't want to give up my car. Like, that's like a fossil fuel talking point, this idea that you've got to give up your car.
Yeah, is the government trying to get people to give up their cars? Are cars being taken away and seized? Like, what? I don't know if that's a thing. That's a concern.
It's not a thing. And the fact that is like the first example they came up with to try to say like how the Herald and the Age are in the middle of this really intense battle between the people trying to take your cars and the people who think climate change is real, I think is quite funny. So I think just like defining yourself, as you said quite articulately, as just the reasonable thing is quite limiting, and it would have been much more sensible to just talk about how good your actual journalism is. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this like attempt to appeal to a much more diverse Australia. Like, this campaign is noticeably more diverse than the last one, which is not really hard considering it consisted of one white guy. But it's like so diverse, particularly in the context of the papers, that it's really funny. And this is like this trend in advertising, right? And like, on one hand, good on advertising agencies and casting agencies to try to like reflect modern Australia. But I don't know if you've noticed this, or maybe you have, but you're too scared to say it, but I give you permission. But you watch a car ad these days, and it is ridiculous. Like, you have, I don't know how to describe, like a quad racial couple. Like, you'll have a guy who's like half Pakistani and half Chinese. You'll have a woman who's like half Icelandic and half Japanese, and then they've got kids that are some like ethnically ambiguous mix of all that. And it's like, this is the modern Australian family. It's like, this is not the modern Australian family. You have just like tried to tick 7 boxes in like one couple. It drives me crazy. Just show real normal people.
I see families like that every day, Oz. I don't know what you're talking about. That's modern Australia. I love modern Australia.
I'm a couple of decades away from everyone being like that. But this ad reminded me of those ads just because it's so incongruous with like how the paper works, who works there and who reads it. Like, there's no data on the demographics of the paper's subscribers, but when you work there, particularly as an editor, and you've got access to, you know, who's reading what stories, who's writing comments, who's writing into the paper, you get a sense of who reads it. And we talk about these at high levels. And the basic takeaway is that it's overwhelmingly older, white, inner city and inner suburban Australians. So it's very aspirational of the paper to pitch their audience as being like young black hijabi women and middle-aged Asian women and hot young black guys. Like, it's very, very aspirational for them to imagine that this is who is reading or would read the paper. And you might say like, look, maybe that's not who reads the paper, but good on them for reaching out to those people. And like, maybe, Scott, but I think that brings me to my main problem with the idea of this campaign. And to be honest, like most campaigns around marketing newspapers and news outlets, it's like the fundamental problem these places have is actually how they operate, their editorial worldview, like the increasingly insular class of people who work for them, and the stories they publish. Like, that's the fundamental problem. You can't just market your way into a magically diverse, young, progressive, woke audience if your newspaper has spent the last decade shifting to the right, stacking itself full of News Corp apparatchiks, taking hard right positions on everything from Gaza to trans issues, seeing an exodus of non-white journalists, ending up in a situation where neither the Age nor the Herald have any Indigenous reporters. You can't like run a newspaper that way and then just do this shiny campaign and be like, but if you're cool and diverse, you should read us. We're not going to take away your car. Like, I just don't think these campaigns make any sense when the fundamental product has gone in the opposite direction.
No, I think that makes total sense. And I mean, the other thing on that is, I think when you talk about that, there is something to reason, but they're not talking about the journalism, just talking about the sensibleness. I think the reason they can't brag, like, if you're into reason, then we have all of the specialist reporters. We have all of the, is because they've spent the last year gutting the newsroom. So they can't talk about that. It just has to be a platitude about sensibleness. And that's why I thought it might be an interesting time to like look at where the 9 papers are at. You know, like for a long time, obviously there has been this tension of the promise from 9 when it took over the papers that they were committed to the Fairfax Media vision of what these papers are, which is like they are the broadsheets quality journalism newspapers in Australia. That's what the SMH and the Age stand for. And then on the other hand, this like inevitable sense that the papers would just become an offshoot of the TV network. And last year was obviously bad. The chair of Nine, Peter Costello, was forced to resign. You had these redundancies, 85 jobs gone from the newspapers, and the CEO, Mike Sneesby, then chose to resign. So what is happening now, just as a stock take, I found it very interesting, Oz, back in August, that Sam Buckingham-Jones at the AFR reported that market analysts were briefing that their analysis showed that the newspaper business was set to overtake the television division for earnings when it comes to Nine, largely attributing that to paying subscribers and lower costs in digital media. What's interesting about that to me, Oz, is if that's the case, if the newspapers are going to overtake television, Nine, to my eye, is going in the opposite direction. First of all, like you're cutting all those jobs from the papers, which is apparently the growth sector. Nine have not disclosed the impact of those cuts, but there are fewer stories published per day, for sure. Clearly, some rounds are getting covered less. You think about what makes people subscribe for news. It's original yarns that you break. It's like city stories, local stories that affect people's lives. All things you can't do if your specialist beat reporters are being asked to like live blog federal politics because you don't have enough staff, which is what is happening now. Then you have like, who is senior management? And over the last couple of years, you've seen the most senior positions at the newspaper division taken by former Daily Mail honcho Luke McIlveen as executive editor, as you mentioned. Above him, former Huffington Post Australia editor-in-chief Tory Maguire as managing...
Both ex-News Corp as well.
Director of publishing, yeah. And look, I've never met them, but they don't come from subscription businesses, Oz. They come from free news websites, which like have largely been proven to be a defunct business model for news. But if you are a television company, if you're Nine Television, then you're quite interested in a model that is closer to the free news model, which is having the maximum number of people visit the homepage possible. Who cares how many are subscribers? It's about maximum visibility. If you're a TV network looking to cross-promote shows and those kind of things, you are more interested, I would say, in that approach. And
that's right. And the sales team there, like, are trained in that way, right? Which is like, how do we get Toyota the most impressions? And we can offer them a deal with like, 1 million people on TV, 1 million people online, and 1 million people on radio. That's how Nine sales operates. But to your point, it's exactly right. It's the opposite to how subscription business operates. It's not just overall clicks. It's like, is this stuff good enough to get people to pay for it?
Exactly, which is sort of the only model for quality news that exists. And like the most egregious example of this lately, Oz, and there's tons of them I know, but like the cross-promotion with Nine, before Stan got the rights to the English Premier League for just this season, the Nine newspapers buried football. Like, unless it was a story about rioting Western Sydney fans and like interracial violence, it didn't get on the front page. And now there are 4 stories a week on like the action, the coaches, the narratives, all of this stuff on English football. Now, like, you could say like what doesn't get covered because of that investment in English football? More importantly, does it really help the papers? Like, people can read about English football everywhere on the internet already. Or is it about driving SEO and people searching and then get them to subscribe to Stan?
Totally.
Which doesn't.
You made this point about rugby union as well. Like how much the paper's been
was
writing
getting
that.
massive coverage. And I just think like prioritizing tie-ins, cross-promotion, like cross-brand ad campaigns for like Toyota, like you marry that with things like, this year, Nine refusing to apologize over running transphobic Clive Palmer ads, which even he apologized for and Nine management didn't. All of this, Oz, it just like says to me that you're killing what works for a subscription news business, which is deep trust and deep connection with your subscribers, in favor of getting in the good books of execs in the television division who want the maximum number of eyeballs on what they have the rights to, of the cross-platform ad campaigns they're selling. And what's at stake is like the future of the country's most celebrated newspapers. Because if that's what the publisher becomes, is it going to be that any longer? It feels like a recipe for stepping on the gas to it becoming a cross-promo platform.
Yeah, it certainly is going in that direction. I mean, the sports stuff is really interesting. Just Vince Rugari, great sports writer, no shade on him. But the fact that so much of the paper seems to follow the 9 investment decisions is really obvious. And I noticed that in the round that I used to cover culture. When I worked there was pressure from 9 to just
we should
boost
disclose
and cover
slightly caught
shows.
up in the redundancies of last year.
Yeah. And I would say that even since I've left, it's become more like that. And I think it's really noticeable to a lot of people what's going on there. And despite Luke McElveen in this ad campaign saying, we are kind of eschewing clickbait and inflammatory positions, it is obvious to everyone who works there and who reads these papers, they're in their most clickbait-driven era since that grim time in the 2010s when Fairfax lost its mind and just tried to be like Huffington Post and news.com.au. You kind of hit the nail on the head, I think, there, Scott, which is like these papers have or had an interesting, profitable, good model based on high quality journalism, trust with audiences, and those people would pay. But because they're caught up in this organization, 9, which even though they are becoming an increasingly big part of, the culture there, the senior culture there, the board culture there is still so TV and like mass market focused. The biggest shareholder in 9 is Bruce Gordon. He's a TV guy. He does not give a shit about the publishing division. And seeing the publishing division become like sort of second fiddle to TV or like reshape its strategic agenda around what works for TV and mass market, it's frustrating to see because not only is it like, I think, bad journalism, it just doesn't really seem to make business sense to a lot of people. They have this clear intention to lose senior experienced staff who would do these unique, refreshing, well-written stories and replace them with like younger people who will just churn out content 4 or 5 times a day. That's not what people are going to subscribe for. The papers also have, back on the diversity point, like no commitment at all to looking like the communities they serve. That's going to be a handbrake on their growth. And yeah, like you put it, it's becoming more clear that they are just there to serve the interests of 9 and not just cross promotion in terms of sport and Stan. You're seeing like journalists from the 9 news desk, like 9 news reporters, do stories that tie into the paper. So now instead of just like being a TV package, it's like write that as a story that will lead the SMH and the Age. And sometimes those stories are fine, but there is a reason why a journalist who works at the Age is different to a journalist who works at 9. They have different sensibilities, different cultures, different experience. The lines are getting increasingly blurred. I just think it's not an amazing trajectory these papers are on.
Yeah, and it's scary. Like these are the newsrooms that have,
yeah, we need them to be
broken
strong.
massive stories. So it's concerning if like the model is towards not having the resources to do that, and the model is more towards having the resources to play the SEO game and get the most people on that homepage.
And look, Scott, good news. If you are really worried about diversity and the concentration of Australia's media, it's all about to get a lot worse. And we'll be back after the break with what's going on and what it means for you.
No!
Scott, we don't talk about 7 West media enough on this show, I think. And it's probably because it's one of the smaller mainstream outlets, but we probably could talk about it more. It's got this stranglehold on the media landscape in WA. The West is the only newspaper in the state. 7 News is a very, very high rating news program on the TV around the country. And 7 owns the rights to the AFL, the most popular code in the country. It's also a very, very, very right-wing news company. An owner in Kerry Stokes. He's not involved or involve himself in controversial political issues like bankrolling war criminal Ben Roberts-Smith's failed defamation campaign. 7 West is kind of like a mini News Corp centered on WA and Perth.
Can I just mention, Oz, that anyone who's not familiar with its output, the West Australian on Instagram is having huge success with some of the most unhinged content I've ever seen. It's sort of like a not satirical Jonathan Pye. Like there's just journalists with like ties undone yelling into the camera about like the decline of the West and Australia and Christian values and stuff. It's a pretty wild scene.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And Scott, Seven is about to get even bigger and more powerful. The company announced it was merging with SCA. It's like largely a radio station. It owns around 100 commercial radio stations around Australia, including Triple M, the Hit Network, and it also owns the Listener podcast network, which produces some of the most popular podcasts in Australia, including Hamish and Andy and Abby Chatfield's podcast. And I think there's a few reasons why this is important. And even if you don't really care about Seven or SCA, you should pay attention to this. And the first reason is just like the inevitable problems of media consolidation, what that means for this country, right? The companies have already announced that as a result of this merger, they will find $30 million in savings. Now, that just means $30 million in job cuts. This industry barely has any jobs left in it. And so whether it ends up being like podcast producers losing their jobs, the handful of like actual real journalists at Seven trying to report local news, people who are getting a start in the industry and learning how to like report or edit TV packages or just use cameras, who then move on to bigger and better things. Losing all of those positions, having all of those cuts is not good for the health of media and democracy in this country. The other problem with media consolidation is the lack of diversity that inevitably comes, right? We've been talking about these massive problems in the US context for the past few weeks, how basically a handful of tech companies essentially own all of the US media now, whether that's podcasts, print, TV, online. It is bad for audiences, it is bad for journalism, and it is only good for the billionaires who run those companies. Australia is in the same position, Scott. Like, we used to have quite strong media competition and we had strong media regulation that ensured that. We used to have this law that said that you could only own either a newspaper, a TV station, or a radio station in one city. That was it. If you wanted to own media, you could have a paper, a TV station, or a radio station in each city. You also had laws that limited how much one company could reach people on television. Those rules over the last few decades have been watered down and essentially abolished in 2017. So now there is nothing standing in the way of one company owning TV networks that reach 100% of people, newspapers and radio stations in the same city. And that is basically what we've ended up with, right? In Nine, you've got a company that owns TV networks, it owns radio stations, it owns newspapers, not to mention the digital footprint. News Corp is the same, minus the radio assets. And now with the merged Seven Southern Cross company, we have the same. Newspapers, TV, and radio. One company owning all of those things. There is a reason, Scott, those laws existed. Not just for competition, not just to ensure competition that helped people trying to make stuff for TV or do journalism, or advertisers who paid for the rights to be put on those platforms, but because governments used to be smart enough to realize they didn't want to be bullied by giant media companies owned by insane right-wing billionaires, right? But we got rid of those laws. So now in Australia, we have 3 giant companies that run everything, and as we've discussed on the show, bully the government regularly on all sorts of policy issues. Nine, the new merged 7 SCA, News Corp, and we've also got Channel 10, which, as we've described, owned by Donald Trump's mate's son, David Ellison. And that's all like the commercial reasons why this stuff is bad. Kind of doesn't need to be said like ideologically, how all of those institutions are basically aligned in terms of who runs them and the interests that they operate within. But one other thing that like occurred to me, Scott, when I was thinking about all of this, Seven West kind of described it as a mini News Corp. News Corp is still, it always is, the elephant in the room in any conversation to do with the Australian media landscape. So News Corp obviously exists, biggest media company in the country. The chair of the ABC, Kim Williams, we've just discussed before, is a former CEO of News Corp. So that's two of the biggest media companies in Australia run either by News Corp or by an ex-CEO of News Corp. Channel 9 just had a little bit of board turnover. Guess who their new chair, Peter Tonner, used to be the CEO of?
Oh, no.
News Corp.
Oh, no.
So you have the ABC and Nine, along with News Corp, all being run by ex-News Corp CEOs. This is like disastrous. This is so bad, and it goes a long way into explaining like why the media feels so shit in this country.
Yeah, and to just your point on consolidation, even if you're not excised by all of that stuff about like political debate and free speech and kind of like the politics of media. If you just like good, funny stuff, it's like
Yeah.
when you have lots of places competing, that's why SCA take a chance on two guys and create Hamish and Andy, the most like beloved personalities in Australian media of the last 20 years. It's why when SCA get into like podcasting, and SCA have made a lot of choices I wouldn't agree with and have a lot of shows that I don't love, but it's like, that's why they take a punt on Abby Chatfield and like back her when, you know, she courts controversy, is they're trying to get a hit, you know, because they're trying to compete with lots of other people. If everything is owned by like 3 companies, there's no incentive to take a risk to create a hit. You just pump every eyeball towards your in-house personalities. There's no competition. No one else is trying to get eyeballs, and you dominate the space with schlock, with boring schlock. So even if you just care about, I don't know, stuff you're interested in,
good stuff,
and funny stuff, this is bad.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, as that brings me to my little keeping tabs, I wanted to mention a little furor that blew up in our world of independent media this week. On Tuesday, Guardian Australia published a story headlined, "Australia's Future Fund discloses huge profits from weapons manufacturers despite fierce criticisms of support for industry." It detailed, based on documents obtained by the Greens Senator David Shoebridge, how taxpayers' money was invested by Australia's Future Fund into all kinds of weapons manufacturers, including Elbit Systems, a company that self-describes as being responsible for the backbone of Israel's drone fleet, and which has been extensively used to, you know, kill civilians, aid workers, journalists in Gaza, and how that investment in companies like Elbit was paying off, creating value for the Future Fund, so basically profiteering off genocide. A month ago, the independent outlet Deep Cut published a piece titled "Exclusive: Future Fund's Investment in Israeli Arms Firms Skyrockets," based on a submission to UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese that they had obtained. This, of course, led Deep Cut and others that people may have seen on social media to say, hold on a sec, Guardian Australia failed to credit them with breaking this story. Now, it's also worth mentioning, Oz, that another place, Michael West Media, which is the website of independent journalist, former Sydney Morning Herald business reporter Michael West, they have published over half a dozen stories on this, going back all the way to December 2023, and they've been chasing the chair of the Future Fund, Greg Combet, for comment on these investments, sending him questions for over a year now that he's refused to get back to them on. So, with all of that said, what do we make of this? Should Guardian Australia, in their story this week, have credited these independent publications for their reporting on the Future Fund story?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? There's always this question in journalism of, are you just taking someone else's scoop, or are you using that as a basis to kind of like do a deeper dive? Or, you know, are you perhaps completely oblivious to the fact that they did that story and you're doing your own separate thing? I think it's always a good principle in journalism, even if you have come across your own sources. If someone in the field has reported something very similar, including like one of the several facts that you've shared, which is what happened in this Guardian story, it makes sense to acknowledge it. Like, you don't really lose much. We try our best to like acknowledge all of our sources in the work that we do, whether it's on the podcast or in the newsletter. I think there is something else going on here though, Scott, that's not just about like the proper journalistic ethics around how you credit sources. There is a real reluctance from mainstream Australian news organizations to acknowledge the existence of independent media, whether that's Michael West News, whether that's Deep Cut, whether that's us. And we've noticed this before. We've had mainstream publications change their stories based on our own reporting, rip off our reporting, and just pretend that we don't exist. We know they exist. We know that you all listen to us. We know that you all read our newsletters. We know that you talk about us. And I think that reluctance comes from a place of insecurity. I think The Guardian in particular, which positions itself as like the most progressive lefty publication and needs people to subscribe to it out of the goodness of their hearts. If they start saying, hey, by the way, these guys Deep Cut did this story before us, check them out. Or, hey, these guys Lamestream covered this before us, check them out. Like, why wouldn't all of their readers just say, fuck you, I'm just going to give Lamestream and Deep Cut my time and money? I do think that is part of what's going on here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, I think, that made me think about a few things. I mean, I think like by the letter of journalism law, which, by the way, doesn't actually exist. That's not a real thing. We all make it up as we go along, and it's just a bunch of loose, contradictory, like, nonsense. But by, I guess, like what my standards would be, Oz, I don't know if Guardian Australia, they had their own source. They did bring different stuff to light. They're different documents. I don't know if they strictly must credit Deep Cut or Michael West by the letter of journalism law. But I think, Oz, the issue here for them is that, like, it doesn't quite, like, pass, like, the sniff test when, if you're the Guardian and you bombard me with these massive pop-ups every time I go on the website saying I need to donate to you if I want to save independent journalism, like, you can't do that and not acknowledge independence. Like, this is what their pop-up says at the moment. Quote, "With big tech, billionaires and authoritarians seizing more control of the world's news and information, our independent journalism needs your support." I don't think you can say that if you refuse to acknowledge, like, really independent media. And, like, yes, The Guardian isn't owned by a billionaire, but Guardian Australia also made $42.1 million in revenue last year. They're fine compared to, like, startup.
They got 120 full-time staff. They're fine.
They're fine compared to, like, the startup independents who are actually fully independent, who, like, are fighting for survival. Like, some of these outlets might not exist in a year. And, like, I'm not going to speak for Anton or Alex at Deep Cut or Michael at Michael West Media and their financial situations, but let me tell you, actual independent media is, like, a huge financial struggle. I'm living at my parents' house so I can do this, Oz. And, like, a credit or a mention can be the difference between, like, publication's survival or not. So, like, did The Guardian have to, like, up the top go, like, as exclusively revealed by Deep Cut and Michael West? No. But I reckon they should have mentioned their reporting somewhere and given them a name check for bringing this to public attention as a story at all before Guardian Australia decided to cover it. Otherwise, I just think, can you really say that you are the defenders of independent media?
Yeah, I think well put. I think sometimes when I read those pop-ups, I'm like, get your hand off it. Like, relax, You're a bunch of, like, overwhelmingly white journalists in Surrey Hills. You're not the front line. You're not fucking Leonardo DiCaprio and Tiana Taylor in one battle after another to close the loop on that one.
Wow. If that's the test, then Scott, that's going to be tough to reach.
Scott, that is it from us. But hey, just before we go, just on that note, I guess, a reminder to support our work by subscribing at lamestream.com.au so Scott can stay in slightly nicer motels when he comes to Sydney. Maybe even move out one day. Who knows?
Maybe.
Who knows?
That's the dream. Who knows?
Please subscribe if you enjoy and appreciate the show. We'd also love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend, and you can email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer, Bez, our video producer, Schwen. Scott, see you on Monday.
See you on Monday, Oz.